Netherlands moved 6 bison to dead coastal dunes. What they did in 18 years was unbelievable. The dunes between Haarlem and Zandvoort looked fine from a distance. Green, rolling, settled into themselves the way old coastlines do. But if you walked them in the early 2000s and knew what you were looking at, you'd have seen the problem immediately. The gray was gone. Gray dunes are not a color accident. They are named for the low carpet of lichen and moss that grows across old, stabilized sand. A carpet that only forms when the ground stays open and dynamic, when bare patches keep appearing across the surface, when the whole system keeps breathing. The European Union lists them as a Natura 2000 priority habitat, which is a formal way of saying there aren't many left and the ones that remain are going fast. By 2007, the gray dunes of Kroonsvlak, a closed reserve sitting 5 kilometers from the center of Haarlem, were going green. And going green, in this case, meant dying. What was closing in two forces had been working on the Dutch coastal dunes for decades, and they fed each other in the worst possible way. The first was invisible: nitrogen. Dutch agriculture releases nitrogen compounds into the air at rates few places on Earth match. The Netherlands is the most intensively farmed country in Europe, and that fertilizer doesn't stay on the fields. It settles out of the atmosphere, on rooftops, roads, and across the ground between the dunes, and it fertilizes everything it touches. In a healthy gray dune, the sand is naturally poor. That poverty is the point. The lichens and mosses that give gray dunes their character can only survive where nutrients are scarce. Nitrogen killed that poverty. Bare sand that had resisted thick vegetation for centuries was now producing dense grass within a single season. The second force was a collapse in the animals that had always cropped that grass. Rabbits had grazed the Dutch dunes for centuries. Not in dramatic herds, just the constant background pressure of millions of small animals keeping the vegetation short, the soil disturbed, the surface open. Then myxomatosis arrived in the 1950s and tore through the population the way fire moves through dry grass. The rabbits partially recovered. Rabbit hemorrhagic disease hit in the 1980s, and again in 2015. By the late 1990s, rabbit numbers in the Dutch coastal dunes had fallen by more than 90%. With nothing eating the grass and nitrogen feeding it from above, the vegetation closed in. Sea buckthorn moved into the gaps first. Hardy, salt-tolerant, viciously thorny, and fast enough to crowd out almost everything else. Behind it came American cherry, an invasive tree originally planted in Dutch forests for bird habitat, with consequences nobody had fully thought through. Conservation crews had been clearing it by chainsaw for 2 decades, hauling cut stems out of the reserve to stop it resprouting. They were running to stand still. The bare sand patches that had always dotted the dune surface were vanishing. The patches that sand lizards used for laying eggs, that sand wasps needed for digging burrows, that the seaside pansy, a small yellow and purple flower, required to germinate at all. Under a closing blanket of grass, shrub, and invasive tree, all of it was going. PWN, the provincial water company that managed 7,300 hectares of these dunes, was already trying to hold the line. Conic horses grazed one section. Highland cattle grazed another. Both did something. The horses cropped the grass. The cattle nibbled young saplings. But neither animal moved the sand. Neither one broke the soil with their weight. And a dune ecosystem doesn't just need eating, it needs physical disturbance. Ongoing, heavy disturbance that keeps the surface open, keeps bare patches forming, keeps the whole mosaic from sealing over into monoculture. The horses and cattle weren't enough. The gray dunes kept shrinking. PWN had a problem that more of the same wasn't going to solve. Before we get to what happened next, a question for the comments. If someone told you the solution to a dying coastal dune system was 6 animals from a Polish forest, would you have taken that bet? Because when the proposal first came up, most of the experts didn't. 6 animals from a Polish forest. Yvonne Kemp had spent years thinking about European bison differently from most people in her field. The received wisdom, drawn almost entirely from the Białowieża forest in eastern Poland, the only place bison had survived in any real numbers through the 20th century, held that they were deep woodland animals. They needed forest cover. They ate browse. They depended on rangers distributing hay through the winter. That was what the evidence said, because that was the only environment the evidence had ever been collected from. Kemp suspected the evidence was incomplete. Bison had been pushed into forest by centuries of human hunting pressure, not by preference. Before that, she argued, they had grazed open and half-open landscapes across the European continent, including coastal plains not unlike the Dutch dunes. The forest was their refuge. The open ground was their original home. In April 2007, she got the chance to test that hypothesis. 3 European bison, 1 bull, 2 cows, were loaded into crates at Białowieża and driven west across Europe in a Polish truck. On April 24th, the ramp dropped at Kronzvlak. They stepped out onto sand that hadn't felt the weight of their species in over 2,000 years. 11 months later, 3 more arrived in a second truck. 6 animals, 220 hectares of fenced dune. No guinterai. The project team locked the fence and waited. What PWN was betting on, what PWN and Ark Nature were attempting, was unusual on several levels, and not just ecologically. Kronzvlak is not remote. It sits 5 kilometers from the center of Haarlem, edged by bike paths and the suburban infrastructure of one of the most densely populated countries in Europe. If 6 bison caused any kind of incident, a fence breach, livestock damage, any confrontation near a public footpath, the political fallout wouldn't just end this project. It would hand every opponent of every rewilding proposal on the continent exactly the story they needed. The pressure to play it safe was real. So the team made a deliberate choice anyway. No supplementary winter feed. No airdrops. No ranger distributed fodder. If Kemp's hypothesis was right, if bison were genuinely adapted to open landscapes, they had to be allowed to prove it. The animals were sourced from Białowieża. Fencing and monitoring were carried jointly by PWN and Ark Nature. The direct cost of the reintroduction was modest against the backdrop of managing 7,300 hectares of dune. But what the economics were really betting on was the idea that letting large animals reshape a landscape for free could accomplish what paid chainsaw crews and contracted cattle grazing hadn't managed over 2 decades of trying. Researchers from the University of Groningen, Utrecht University, and Has Den Bosch began mapping the reserve. Fixed transects were established. Baseline vegetation surveys completed. The first winter came. The bison didn't wait to be fed. They dug through the thin dune soil for roots. They stripped bark from creeping willow and oak saplings. They rolled in the sand to clean their coats, scratch parasites, and regulate their body temperature the way bison do everywhere. But the Kronzvlak herd rolled more often than any bison population anyone had measured before. Each roll carved a shallow pit, roughly 2 meters across. Bare sand opened to the sky, and in those pits something was starting to happen. What the ground was already telling them, sand wasps appeared in the wallow edges, digging burrows in the loose soil. Sand lizard tracks began crossing the open patches. And then something no one had expected to see returned so quickly. Seaside pansies. The small yellow and purple flower that requires bare sand to germinate had been absent from large sections of the reserve for years. It was coming back, not because anyone planted it, but because an 800-kilogram animal had opened the ground. The invasive cherry trees that crews had been fighting for 2 decades? The bison were ring-barking them, tearing long vertical strips from the trunks until the trees died standing, and became habitat for deadwood beetles, and let light fall back to the ground. Project studies also found that the dense, oily coat of a European bison carries dozens of plant species at any given time, dispersing seeds across the herd's full range as it moves. The conic horses and highland cattle grazing the same reserve moved far less seed. The bison, simply by walking and rolling, were stitching the dune mosaic back into connection in ways the lighter animals couldn't replicate. The rangers walking those transects every season could see the change underway. The formal numbers weren't in yet. The 8-year study was still running. But the direction was becoming hard to ignore. The question was whether it would hold. If any of this is surprising you, and I suspect it is, hit like. The study results are coming, and they're worth hearing. 18 years, measured in 2018, Kemp and her co-authors published the results of an 8-year vegetation study in the journal Mammal Research. The paper compared fixed transects in 3 separate grazing areas inside the national park. One grazed by bison and conic horses, one by free-ranging cattle, one with no large grazers at all. The results were unambiguous. The Bison area showed the strongest reduction in woody plant encroachment of the three sites. Open vegetation, the structural condition gray dunes depend on, had held steady where the bison roamed. In the cattle area, encroachment had continued. In the unraised area, it had accelerated. The bison had achieved what cattle couldn't, and what 2 decades of manual clearance hadn't managed across the full reserve. The herd had also grown. By 2018, 33 calves had been born in 10 years. The reserve had been expanded twice, from the original 220 hectares to 280 in 2012, then to 330 in 2014, as PWN and local authorities decided the evidence justified giving the project more room to operate. By 2023, the population had stabilized at around 22 animals, with surplus bison translocated to reintroduction projects in Spain, Germany, and other parts of the Netherlands. The 6 animals from 2 Polish trucks had become, through direct lineage, the founding stock of a continent-wide expansion of the species, small, still, but real. In 2020, the project fitted one of the cows with the first high-resolution GPS collar ever placed on a European bison, opening new research into how the animals actually use a landscape across seasons. That data hadn't existed before. It would shape reintroduction decisions across Europe for years to come. The species distribution maps were changing. So were the plant surveys. Seaside pansy colonies in areas where the flower hadn't been recorded for years. Sand wasp nesting densities rising across the bison range. The gray dune structure, open sand, low vegetation, a recovering lichen carpet, returning to ground it had been losing for decades. And then there was the water. PWN had always managed these dunes for one primary purpose. 7 million people across the province of North Holland. About 45% of that water passes through the dune system before it reaches a tap. Rainwater and pretreated river water sinking into the sand, filtering through 60 meters of dune, and emerging clean enough that PWN uses no chlorine in the process. Only ultraviolet light for final sterilization. In engineering terms, those 7,300 hectares are a biological water treatment plant that runs on gravity and lichen. And it only works if the ecosystem stays open and dynamic. Closed canopy scrub doesn't filter water the way an open dune does. Stagnant vegetation holds the wrong nutrients. A grass monoculture keeps water near the surface instead of letting it drop through the sand profile. The same processes that were killing gray dune biodiversity were degrading the filtration system underneath it. The 2 problems were the same problem, seen from different angles. By keeping the dunes open, the bison were protecting the drinking water for nearly 2 million Dutch citizens. Clean water out of the tap in 800,000 homes between Haarlem and Den Helder. Nobody in the project planned it that way. PWN owned the land because of the water supply. The bison were brought in for biodiversity. The discovery that those 2 jobs protected each other was not in the original proposal. It was a finding. The founding bull of the Kronsvlak herd is gone now. His preserved body stands in the visitor center at Overveen, head turned slightly to one side, as if still listening for something out in the dunes. His descendants move through those dunes today. Sand wasps hover over wallows the herd carved last summer. Children walking the bison trail see Europe's largest land animal grazing among lichens that need its weight to survive. And in hundreds of thousands of homes across North Holland, a cold tap runs clean, because an 800-kilogram animal keeps rolling in the sand. 6 animals. 220 hectares. 18 years. It turned out the dunes just needed something heavy enough to move them. Next week, the wolves that came back to a valley everyone said they couldn't reach, and what they did to the river in the years that followed. Subscribe so you don't miss it.